This is Mr. Shea, American Pageant, Chapter 12, AP United States History at Notre Dame High School. Okay, we pick up at the War of 1812. Preparing for the war, the United States goes into it really not in a good position, lacking a regular army with any real training, supplies, uh, not enough weapons, a navy that's not too strongly built or prepared to fight a war, especially with England, generals who are outdated or in positions of power just due to their um, heritage, lineage, uh, connection to older generals, and really a poor strategy going into the war to begin. Their offensive strategy is aimed at Canada, but probably not where it should have been. They should have just tackled Montreal first. Tackling Montreal would have cut off uh, west all areas west of Montreal, which would have been important for trade and given the United States a very decisive early victory and possibly could have discouraged England to just end the war at that point. Instead, they fail to launch a three-pronged attack at and excuse me across the Canadian border. The British, on the other hand, have a very good start to the war. Their generals are well trained and prepared. They have enough troops, supplies. They look to be clearly the superior force. Where the Americans did have some success would be on the water. Surprisingly, um, Americans had built some ships. We know that the buildup of the Navy during the Adams administration had provided the country with a significant amount of ships that were never really used. And one of those ships, the Constitution, which is superior to most of the British ships in size, firepower, and manpower. The Great Lakes were very important. Remember, the Great Lakes lead down into the Mississippi, the Ohio River Valley, and then up into Canada. This is an extremely important strategic area, and it's weird to think of lakes as a place where battles are fought, but these lakes are vast in size and enormously important to trade and control of the Ohio River Valley and even down into the Mississippi. There were some early victories. Perry's victory was extremely important. He built his fleet really on the side of the lakes and was able to then defeat the British. And later, those retreating troops are finally captured and beaten for good at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. So it was really important and significant to win the battle for the Great Lakes. So despite that victory, the Americans still faced a overwhelming force. The British assembling over 10,000 troops and preparing to march towards New York along the river route. And had they been successful in this march, there is no question they would have taken at least upper New York, cut off New England from the rest of the country, and made it very difficult, maybe not for the Americans to have the same result in the end, which is basically everybody returned uh, or calling it a draw, but it would have been more difficult at the Treaty of Ghent to reclaim these lost lands had they lost them because it would have been so significant. Thomas MacDonough commands probably one of the more famous naval battles, or one of the most significant, um, at Plattsburgh, defeating the larger British force and forcing them to retreat back to Canada. This was extremely important, probably the most significant naval battle of the War of 1812, because the British had to retreat back to Canada and did not or were not able to take upper New York and again further isolate New England, which would have been catastrophic for the United States. Okay, when you're looking at different places where the British launched attacks, another area was the Chesapeake Bay area. First, Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. is actually very poorly defended. Militiamen scurry and run away. And the British march almost unopposed towards Washington, D.C. Madison is forced to retreat and leave the capital. The whole entire capital city is burned. Um, to the ground in very symbolic victory for the British. However, while this was going on, the United States forces were preparing for the British fleet at Baltimore to defend Fort McHenry, and there was a large buildup there. And the United States, the Americans, although they gave up Washington D.C. so easily, did not give up any ground at Baltimore Harbor, and the British fleet was unable to successfully capture the harbor. And what came out of that? Well, obviously the Star Spangled Banner, written by Francis Scott Key during the bombardment of the fort, was written, and of course stays with us today as our national anthem that we hear before sports contests every single night. The next area that the British focused on was the New Orleans area, and Andrew Jackson, who had just won the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, was given command to defend New Orleans with a much smaller force, and a mixed force of French and pirates and militiamen and some regular regiments, and the British here coming with superiorly trained troops, outnumbered the Jackson's men at New Orleans, but they make a really catastrophic mistake when they launch a frontal assault. They lose over 2,000 men in a half an hour, while Jackson only suffers less than 100 casualties. This is a great victory at New Orleans, not because of the numbers that were killed or wounded by the British, but or I guess the numbers play a role in it, but just the sheer domination of Jackson's troops over the British. The Americans had felt defeat after defeat. I mean, even Baltimore was, it could be considered a victory because they held off the British, but really, in reality, Washington D.C. was burned to the ground. The naval victories were great in the Great Lake regions and in New York, but it was more of desperation and just holding the British at bay. To have such a decisive victory was extremely important for the American spirit, even though in reality the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed 2 weeks earlier than the Battle of New Orleans. But the Battle of New Orleans would be the trigger point, the spark that led the country into nearly 2 decades of heightened nationalism and American spirit, bringing the country together as a whole, really for the first time since the Revolutionary War. It also allowed for the rise of Andrew Jackson as a war hero. Okay, here's some of the battles in the War of 1812 in Washington, D.C., a British victory, and there's Baltimore, which was successfully defended. Here is Perry in the Great Lakes region. Up here you see some Battle of the Thames. Okay, so you just get an idea of where all these battles were actually taking place. And here is the Battle of New Orleans, which was really critical, even though the war at that point was already over technically. This is just a cartoon of Madison running from the Capitol as it burns down. So during the war, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander the First, proposed to get England and America together because really the Tsar wanted to make sure that England was focused primarily on what was going on in Europe as its ally versus messing around with the Americans and possibly losing valuable troops and supplies and resources. John Quincy Adams, who at this point is a very established foreign diplomat, heads the commission for the Americans and initially rejects the British offer, which, as you could read, I'll read it to you, but a neutralized Indian buffer state in the Great Lake region, control the Great Lakes, and a substantial port of Concord, Maine. They reject this right away. The British feel comfortable asking for this because of their early successes. However, once the British hear of Baltimore and they hear of Perry's success and most importantly McDonough's success in the Great Lake region, they realize, along with the idea that they're focusing at the Congress of Vienna on how they are going to deal with France moving forward and divvying up Napoleon's former Europe, that it's just not worth the argument, and they've lost their biggest bargaining chip, they've lost their leverage, so they decide to sign the Treaty of Ghent, which essentially is just a ceasefire armistice. Both sides agree to stop fighting, and in that armistice or that treaty, all of the pre-war boundaries are just restored as if it didn't happen. Of course, during the war and towards the end of the war, there are groups, especially from New England specifically, and the Federalists are very involved in New England. There is talk of secession from the Union, or a separate peace with, or a separate peace with Great Britain. But that would be the radical faction. For the most part, the Federalists, even in New England, were not talking about this. This is very few individuals, but clearly during the time and after the war, those would be the stories that are told because the opposing political party, the Republicans, obviously wanted to highlight this treasonous talk, this lack of loyalty, lack of nationalism. Well, the Federalists actually come together in a meeting in the Hartford Convention. Full delegations are sent from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and partial delegations from New Hampshire and Vermont, where these men meet for 3 weeks to discuss their grievances that they had with the federal government during the War of 1812. And the final report was much more moderate than probably some would have considered during or thought during the time, or was reported during the time, which was the idea of secession and alliance with Great Britain. In reality, they're not asking for those things. And I'll read some of this: demanded financial assistance from Washington to compensate for the lost trade as a result of the British blockade. That's where that comes from. They want constitutional amendments requiring a two-third vote to prevent future embargoes if a new state's going to be admitted or if war is going to be declared. And they also sought to abolish the Three-Fifths Compromise, which they felt gave the South an unfair advantage in representation in the House of Representatives, and thus increased power that they did not deserve based on the system. They also want to limit the president to a single term. In addition to limited to the president to a single term, they also called for the president to not be allowed, or a president not to be allowed to be elected from the same state two terms in a row, because they resented the idea that, with the exception of John Adams' 4 years, all the early presidents were from Virginia. And there we go. Once completed at the Hartford Convention, they sent 3 men, an envoy from Massachusetts, to carry the demands to Washington. But what they didn't realize was, number one, New Orleans had taken place, and people were celebrating in the streets and excited, American pride and nationalism, and also the later than the Treaty of Ghent. So here are these 3 members who had the idea of war as a leverage point, a tipping point in their favor, now gone, plus the country behind the war as a result of the Battle of New Orleans. They are just really shamed and never present their demands to the government. And here's just a depiction of them begging to go back to the king. And the election of 1812, this just shows you the Electoral College, and you can get a sense that the Federalists are really dying out. It's going to be even worse in the next election with Monroe. Okay, so although the War of 1812 was small as far as numbers go for casualties, it was important for a couple of reasons. One, because the Battle of New Orleans specifically, the surge of nationalism was very impactful on the young country. The fact that the United States did take arms up against the British resulted in respect around the world for foreign diplomats, foreign American diplomats. No longer were they going to be treated as a unwanted guest. Now they had to be treated with legitimacy. And then war heroes that really came out of the War of 1812, such as Perry, McDonough, William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, who will both be later president, although Harrison won't serve for long. He'll die fairly quickly. The Federalist Party is gone as a result of the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention. I mean, they'll run one more candidate, but they're going to be so soundly defeated that the Federalist Party will cease to exist in any meaningful way as a result of the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention. Indians are, as a result, are left defenseless without British assistance anymore, and must sign several treaties giving up their entire claim to the Ohio River Valley and the lands that went around along with those. So, somebody, the group that we're not talking about here are the Canadians. And remember, the Canadians are still under British rule, but they feel betrayed. Some fought during the war. They saw an opportunity to push their advancement, their advantage in numbers, to create a buffer state between the United States and Canada, not only for Indians but also against future invasion by Native Americans. In 1817, the Rush-Bagot Agreement between Britain and the United States severely limited naval armament on the lakes. This was really important because after the War of 1812, there was still fighting sometimes that would go on. There was disputes between two. It was just a perfect place that a war could start unintentionally. So this agreement, which limits the amount of ships that could be present, warships on the lake, eliminates the possibility of fighting breaking out. Here's Washington, D.C. This is gives you an idea. The capital had to be rebuilt. Monroe will move into the rebuilt White House, or partially rebuilt White House in 1817. There's the Capitol building. You can see was also burned. It shows charred here. That had to be rebuilt as well. It took 3 years to fix that situation. Okay, so what are some of the results of the heightened nationalism after the War of 1812? You have an explosion in not only just pure national love in the country, but also in the arts. American artists become more comfortable in getting out there and producing works. You have famous authors like Washington Irving and Cooper all of a sudden emerging onto the scene. You have as far as textbooks go, now instead of using English textbooks in schools, American textbooks are written by American writers. America certainly identifies more as a nation, not as separate states at this point, although that's going to kind of change again. We're going to transition back out of nationalism. The Bank of the United States is extended by Congress in 1816. So the Army is expanded, the Navy is expanded. So there's quite a bit that takes place as a rise of the rising nationalism. Manufacturing, which we know is spurred on by the embargo of 1807 in New England and the North specifically, continues to grow. However, Great Britain, seeing this trend, begins to attack the Yankee marketplace. How do they do that? By lowering the prices. They're trying to use their superior size and monetary wealth to eliminate their competition by offering lower prices on their goods, with the hope that eventually they would knock out their competitors and then they could raise prices back to where they wanted to. But Congress responds, and this is a very nationalistic move, with a higher tariff, 20 to 25% on imports, and it was a sign that of nationalism that the Congress is going to protect American business interests. Henry Clay proposed what he called his American system, and his American system had 3 parts to it, 3 components. One, a strong banking system that can easily provide credit for American investors and American homeowners for expansion, and the country itself. So it just a strong banking system so that credit can easily flow and expansion can take place. Revenue is from the tariff. So he believed in it had to generate revenue, taxes, in order to pay for a lot of their programs. In order to do that, don't tax the American people necessarily. Use the tariff policies in order to accomplish those goals. And then he wanted to build a network of roads and canals. So the idea that America now had to focus on its infrastructure. He wanted better transportation. He wanted a better infrastructure that would connect, not only increase trade and make trade flow easier, but also connect the states even further economically, so that they'd be so intertwined that it would become a stronger nation. The problem he faced was not really the first two. The problem he faced was federal funding for the last one. We know today there's always whether it's a bailout or a new program where the federal government sends money to the states for infrastructure rebuild or improvement. Back then, the Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans, remember, are strict constructionists, and they believe that is not in the Constitution. The federal government is not supposed to give money to the states for internal improvements. And even though Congress passed a law in 1817 to fund the states $1.5 million, President Madison vetoed that law. So states were really on their own to focus on what Clay would consider the third part of his American system: internal improvements and infrastructure building. There's Henry Clay. He'll be a very important figure as we move forward as the great compromiser. Just a symbol of nationalism. Okay, so James Monroe, he's another Republican. He's from Virginia. Nothing spectacular about him. Very sound, very level-headed leader. And as he comes into office, and he does his his nationwide tour, there's an idea that an era of good feelings have begun. The economy seems to be going well. People are loving their country. The country is growing in so many different ways. But in the reality, there were things that were taking place that were not really would not fall under the label of good feelings. Some of these things included, issues with the tariff. The wildcat banks in the West were issuing too much credit to people who couldn't afford it. Eventually, they were going to foreclose on a lot of those loans. Public lands were highly contested. That means like people were literally killing each other over these lands, and bribery and everything else were going on. Sectionalism was crystallizing. The idea of the North versus the South was crystallizing that very distinct sections in the country, and that's going to be crucial, as we know, going to the Civil War, since they're going to fight a war against each other. But the differences between the two, the rising wealth in the North versus the South, who remains agriculturally based and doesn't share in the growing wealth that the North experiences. And then slavery is becoming a very important issue and more of a hotly debated issue, especially with the expansion and addition of new states. In 1819, the first economic panic or crisis, takes place since the Washington administration. It was due to, again, overspeculation in Western lands. The banks had extended themselves. Wildcat banks in the West, they were called. And when the National Bank said, "Listen, you need to get these properties or get the money in," these wildcat banks are forced to foreclose on farmers, and this clearly is not good for the economy because it limits expansion. Also, the idea of debtor's prison still existed back then, where people can be put in prison just for owing a little bit amount of money, and there's a big movement against these during this time period, and the system's going to change because it seemed unreasonable, as people would not be able to pay off their debts if they were in prison. The panic hit the poorer classes the hardest, as it always seems to do. The idea of, again, imprisoning debtors seemed to be outdated and cruel. Also, during this time, as a result of the Panic of 1819, you have sorry about that, guys, you have a growing sense of the lower to middle class working together politically. And this is going to really pave the way for Andrew Jackson not too long from now, about a decade and a half away, where he's going to win the presidency in the most democratic election up to that point. The West is also an issue because of the growing size and the number of states that are being added. 9 states are added. They're trying to keep the balance between North and South. Remember that, yes, land is cheap. That's why the expansion happens. But the reason they keep the balance between North and South when it comes to slavery, and I may be jumping ahead here, guys. I am. I'll hold off on talking about that. People moved west because of the old tradition of wanting to move west, the cheap land that's available. New immigrants look at it as the American, it's not the American dream yet as we think about it, but the idea that they can find this abundant land west, and new roads like the Cumberland Road make it easier to move to the west. The steamboat makes transportation quicker and more efficient. So you can understand why people move west. I mean, the Land Act of 1820 authorized a buyer to purchase 80 acres at a minimum of $1.25 an acre in cash. This is an incredible deal, and it especially with some of the soil in the old South being worked out too much with tobacco, that there was a great demand for this land. So in 1819, it's where we get the sectionalism. Missouri wanted to enter in as a state, and they made a request, and they had plenty of people there, so there should have been no issue with this at all. But Congress passes the Talmadge Amendment, which says that no more slaves could be brought to Missouri. It also provided for the gradual emancipation of children born to slave parents, and this outrages southern slaveholding states. They see this as a direct threat, not only to slavery, but to the idea that if Congress could do this to Missouri, then Congress could do this to them in their southern states and outlaw slavery. Remember that as states entered, as states entered the Union one by one, it was always entered as slave free, slave free, slave free, because they wanted, the Southerners especially wanted to keep the balance. Remember that northern populations are growing very fast, and therefore they're getting more representatives in the House. But the Senate is always equal. Remember, two representatives from each state, two senators from each state, regardless of size. So if a slave state or free state enters without a slave state, that's going to tip the balance of power in the Senate, and the South just couldn't deal with that, or didn't want to experience that possibility. So it was very important for them to keep the political balance as they moved forward. So Henry Clay, the great compromiser, comes up with the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise is very simple. Missouri will enter as a slave state, but at the same time, Maine is going to be carved out of what was just all of Massachusetts and enter as a free state, thus keeping the balance in the Senate equal. In addition to that, all future land settled in the West would the issue of slavery would be determined by a 3630 parallel line, that was imaginary line drawn across the Louisiana Territory. All future states that entered above the line would be free, below the line would be slave. It was a very important document. It was a fair peace for them, a fair compromise for them at the time, although it would be ignored time and time again as we get closer to the Civil War. It's finally found unconstitutional during the Dred Scott decision many years later. James Monroe in the election of 1816 is able to win the election almost unanimously, one of the largest landslides in American history. And here you go, guys. This is the Missouri Compromise line right here. Here's Missouri, which oddly enough goes in above the line, but it's a slave state, but any future state in these territories would go in as free states. And Maine, carved out of Massachusetts in 1820, admitted as a free state. Okay, a few court cases that are of note that, again, Chief Justice Marshall increases the federal government's power over states. The idea that, remember the Federalist Party, this is what they believed in. The first one is McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland, the state of Maryland actually attempts to tax the notes of the federal bank located in Maryland. Marshall rules that it is unconstitutional for the state to tax the national bank, that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and therefore, citing the implied powers in the Constitution, he rules in favor of, obviously, the federal bank. In Cohen's versus Virginia, he is ruling on the case, and although the Cohen brothers are found guilty of selling illegal lottery tickets, the fact that they appealed to the Supreme Court was very significant, because it showed or established the precedent that the Supreme Court, the federal court, was superior to the state Supreme Courts, and that it had the power to overrule state Supreme Courts. And that a precedent is established in Cohen's versus Virginia in 1821. In Gibbons versus Ogden, a dispute over the waterways between New York and New Jersey, where the state of New York is attempting to gain a monopoly on this waterway, or give away a monopoly on this waterway to benefit itself. Marshall reiterates the constitutional clause that only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce, again striking a blow for federal power over the states. In Fletcher versus Beck in 1810, Marshall focuses, in this case, is really focused on not only property rights, but contract as well. And the next case is more contract, but this one is on property right, where even though the Georgia legislature had granted this acreage. You see 35 million acres, which is an enormous amount, to private speculators, and it was a shady deal. When the new Georgia legislature came into power, they realized it was a false deal or a phony deal or a shady deal, and they tried to cancel it. The Supreme Court decreed that it was a contract, and even though it was fraudulently secured, it could not be overturned. So states can't, basically it says states can't intervene and take away private property. In Dartmouth College versus Woodward, Dartmouth College had a charter going back to colonial days, and the state was trying to revoke the charter, and Marshall ruled along with the Supreme Court that contracts are valid and cannot be overruled by a state. Okay. Daniel Webster rises onto the scene during this time as well. He becomes a very prominent political leader. He is really Marshall's hand in, or twin in Congress, consistently giving very Federalist-like speeches. He's commonly spends time either trying or participating in Supreme Court cases. These two really kept the Federalist ideals or ideology alive in the American government decades after the Federalists had already died out. Here's Daniel Webster. Okay, the Anglo-American Convention is significant in 1818 because it allows for that Oregon Territory, which you might have remembered on the map before, which was jointly occupied for a period of time, and later we're going to talk about it. They'll figure out a dividing point, which will conclude or cap off or finalize the continental United States. Okay, in Florida, remember that the Americans claim West Florida, but the Spanish still control the majority of Florida. Andrew Jackson is actually sent into Florida to stop or deal with some Indians in Florida who were raiding into Georgia and such, which the Spanish were supposed to do as according to the Pinckney Treaty. Jackson goes beyond his expectations of his leaders, and really without their authorization, and actually takes all of Florida. John Quincy Adams is called in to fix the problem. He cites the Pinckney Treaty, signs the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, giving the United States Florida. And you can see here the Adams-Onis Treaty. Okay, so in Europe, after Napoleon, European old monarchs are beginning to take shape again, old governments. Americans are alarmed at the possibility Russia extending down as far as San Francisco, claiming, with their jurisdiction. That's what they claimed that their jurisdiction was. And Monroe and John Quincy Adams are concerned. But John Quincy Adams is smart enough to understand that there's no reason to sign a treaty with Great Britain or anything like that. George Kenyon offered that to the United States. He said it was a waste and would make the United States look less superior to that of to Great Britain. They instead understood that Great Britain would never allow colonization or any interference from the other European powers into South America because that would hurt Great Britain's economic interests. Therefore, they set out the Monroe Doctrine, which was just given in a speech by Monroe in 1823, which made these claims that were really lacked the United States lacked the power to enforce it, but they knew the British would enforce it with the strongest navy in the world indirectly. So it was a very shrewd political move by John Quincy Adams and James Monroe, and it really had two basic features: no further colonization or intervention in South America or in any part of the Americas by European powers. European powers looked at it and they were upset by it, but they could do nothing about it because they knew that Great Britain protected those areas. The treaty, the Russo-American Treaty, also gives some comfort with the Russian dilemma, setting a boundary line between Alaska and Russia. Monroe Doctrine really has no legal basis other than just an international message sent from the United States that without any real enforcement, and really becomes a non-important doctrine until later years. Okay, guys, good luck on your quiz.